So let's talk about diagnostics within Azure. Now, certainly each of the resources that we've been working with has a diagnostics option. So this is a resource group, and I can go down and look at the diagnostic settings for the resources in this group, which is another great reasons we organize things into resource groups. Going back into it, we can choose our Azure web app. And again, going down into here, we can see that Azure web app does some stuff automatically, but we can right now all the diagnostics is turned off, and we can certainly start to turn on different diagnostic settings if we wanted to start tracking diagnostics from Azure web apps. Okay, going back up to here, if we go into the services and we start looking at Azure Monitor, right? So Azure Monitor is a relatively new dashboard for all of the diagnostics activities within your account. So monitor your applications and your infrastructure all in one place. So instead of it being so diverse across, even at the resource group level or into individual resources, we can look at metrics, we can look at logs, we can set up alerts, all within Azure Monitor. So Azure Monitor, very rightly, is starting to become the home for diagnostics. If we see down here, there is a diagnostics settings tab into Azure Monitor, and we're seeing the same resources that were shown in the diagnostic settings at the resource group level. So now it's all in one place for the same effect. Let's go over and look at a virtual machine. So here's a virtual machine that I created the other day. And you can see that does actually fire off CPU and network, etc. But if we go down to diagnostics settings, there's a diagnostics settings menu here. First of all, if you might have to turn on diagnostics. Okay, so it was something that I enabled when I was setting up the virtual machine. But when you go here to this overview screen, it might say, please turn on the diagnostics. And so there's an agent that needs to be installed. Let's switch over to the agent tab. So the virtual machine is actually modified in order to throw off diagnostic settings. So if you don't enable the agent, you don't get diagnostics at the Azure level. In order to have diagnostics, it needs a storage account. You can see here on the agent tab that the storage account has a 5 GB disk quota. So what that means is that as it's accumulating logs, it's going into a storage account, and that storage account is actually an additional thing outside of your virtual machine that could cost you money. Now, the cents per gigabyte isn't too bad, but 5 GB of storage being used or 4 GB of storage being used, it's still money that you should account for, essentially, right? You can actually remove the diagnostics agent if it's giving you trouble. This is one of the things. If your diagnostics is not working, you can basically reinstall it. You can remove the agent, and then come back here, and it'll allow you to turn it back on. Okay, so we'll start off there. Now, there are a number of sets of diagnostics that your virtual machine produces. First off is the performance counters. So we saw on the overview screen, CPU, memory, disk, network. Like those are the sort of the basic set of performance counters. What that means is every 60 seconds in this configuration, every 60 seconds, your CPU is being tested, your memory is being tested, your disk and your network. Okay. So if we go back to a diagram like this, this is every 60 seconds. Every minute you can see as you move your mouse, the CPU has been tested. That means it's not actually being tested every second or, in between times. Go back down to diagnostic settings. Okay. Now, if this is not, let's say you want more fine-grained or less fine-grained settings on this, you can certainly customize that. Okay. So if I said custom, then I can basically, there's 5 pages of performance settings. Okay, So if CPU doesn't even show up, well, processor, I guess it makes sense. So under processor information, we've got percent processor time, percent privilege time, percent user time, processor frequency. So we could sample this every 20 seconds if we really wanted to know what the processor is doing more frequently than every 60 seconds. We can disable some of these things. Again, this is all getting into our log file. This is all getting into our storage account. There's really no sense collecting things if you're never going to use them. So, you know, it sort of makes some intelligent choices in terms of your custom settings, or you can just be happy with the basics. Hitting save is going to then have to go to the agent within your virtual machine and change how it sends agent stuff back to Azure. So those are the performance counters. We also have logs. So think of the Windows event log in your Windows system. It has application security system as 3 of the tabs. So you can basically equate this to the Windows event log, being able to have those events bubble up into Azure itself and then being able to monitor those types of events. You can see that if you want to log, if this is an IIS machine, you can collect your IIS logs and store that within Azure. Any sort of failed requests, you know, etc. If you've got .NET applications and you want to get tracing output generated outside of your VM into Azure, you can enable that as well. Okay, so logs is pretty straightforward. Crash dumps is pretty self-explanatory. It's disabled by default. Are you really going to be investigating the contents of the memory? It's a very specific use case for you needing the contents of the memory when a process fails, if you're going to be able to have the technical capability to investigate that. Syncs are external services. So for instance, Application Insights is considered one. You can have your diagnostic data fed into Application Insights. So that's how you set up diagnostics for a virtual machine. If we head back to the Azure Monitor, I actually have a shortcut here. Head back to the Azure Monitor. We can see that it allows you to look at activities, alerts, metrics, logs. We're going to look into that in a future video. But what we're concerned with is the diagnostic settings for virtual machines. And we can see here that Azure Monitor has applications, virtual machines in preview mode, containers, and network, which is Network Watcher. So now, right now, if I click it, it's still collecting data. So we're going to let that run for a little bit, and we'll come back to that. But basically, as the virtual machine starts filling its logs, we're going to start to be able to look at the health and performance of that virtual machine, or all my virtual machines, using Azure Monitor.